For 3 generations, Mitchell Farm had been our home, a legacy passed down from my grandfather, who had built the farmhouse by hand in 1954. It wasn't just land, it was part of our family's soul, our history. I could still hear Grandpa's voice echoing in my mind. A man's right to his land is sacred in America. But everything changed the day Meadowrest Estates started creeping up next door, replacing fields of corn with rows of cookie-cutter mansions. It didn't take long for the letters to start arriving, thick envelopes adorned with gold-embossed HOA logos. They were polite at first, inviting me to join their community, to adhere to their rules. But I knew better. My land predated their development by over 60 years. I wasn't interested in joining their HOA. I tossed the letters straight into the fire. But then came the threats, official notices, violations for everything from my barn being an eyesore to my tractor being improperly stored. They wanted my property, but I wasn't about to give it up without a fight. The real trouble began when Carol Henderson became the president of the HOA. She marched onto my porch one sunny afternoon with a confident air, her designer heels clicking against the porch as she handed me a thick binder full of bylaws and architectural guidelines. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "I'm a former corporate attorney. I specialize in problem properties, and your little farm is officially problem number 1. She handed me the binder, filled with tabs highlighting the violations they had found. The fines totaled more than my yearly pension. I tried to explain the historical significance of my property, showing her the certificate from the County Historical Society that protected it from new development. Carol didn't care. "Actually, Mr. Mitchell, that exemption expired when the county rezoned last year," she said, her voice cold as ice. She flashed a glossy brochure in my face. "We're planting a beautiful community garden right here where your barn stands. You should be grateful we're increasing your property value." I watched as she got back in her gleaming white SUV, noticing something missing: the small, private property sign that had marked my eastern boundary for decades. In its place was a Meadowrest Estates marker. The war had begun. Later that week, on a Sunday morning, I caught Carol and 2 board members in the act, physically removing my property marker. I tried to remain calm, explaining that they were on my land and had no right to remove my sign. But Carol just kept smiling that practice smile and handed me another violation notice. She told me to attend the HOA meeting on Tuesday evening if I had any complaints. It didn't matter. I wasn't about to let them take my land, my family's legacy. But I couldn't have predicted just how far they would go, or how far I would have to go to stop them. By the end of the week, I had installed a new sign, stronger, larger, cemented into the ground. It disappeared by noon, and so began a battle of wills. Each time I installed a new sign, it would vanish within hours, leaving me frustrated and determined. Eventually, I installed a hidden camera in a birdhouse. When I checked the footage, I saw Carol and her crew removing my sign again, this time using power tools. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. I took the footage to Sheriff Davis, hoping for help, but his words were a punch to the gut. "This is a civil matter, James. You're going to need a lawyer." So I did what I had to do. I spent $3,000 of my retirement savings on a lawyer. But when I showed the lawyer, Wilson, my documents, his expression said it all before he even spoke. "It's a gray area," he said, sliding the papers back across his desk. "You could fight this, but it will cost upwards of $50,000. And the HOA has deep pockets. They could bankrupt you with fines." The idea of losing everything my family had worked for weighed heavy on me. It was becoming clear that they weren't just trying to intimidate me. They wanted to take my land, piece by piece. As I sat on my porch that night, contemplating my next move, Martha, an elderly neighbor, rolled up on her motorized scooter, a plate of cookies balanced on her lap. "They took your sign again, didn't they?" she asked, handing me the cookies. She had seen it all before. Her nephew had lost his home to an HOA in Florida due to petty fines and regulations. "They're worse than the banks," she said. "Sometimes you need to fight fire with fire." And then, with a knowing smile, she added, "Or find something even more surprising." I wasn't sure what she meant at first, but I was about to find out. 3 months had passed since the HOA war had begun, and the situation was escalating. My mailbox overflowed with violation notices, each one more absurd than the last. They'd fined me for having an eyesore of a weathered barn, a poorly stored tractor, and for the supposed violation of livestock ordinances, despite the fact that I didn't even have any livestock. Each fine piled on top of the other, and by now I owed over $112,000, a sum that was nearly impossible to fathom. My teacher's pension couldn't even cover a fraction of it. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst came when I returned home one day to find that Carol Henderson and her crew had removed a 200-year-old oak tree from my land, the very tree where my grandfather had proposed to my grandmother. It had stood there for decades, a symbol of our family's legacy, and now it was gone, replaced with a sign that read, "Future site of Meadow Rest Community Garden." What had they done? I marched across the property line, fury building in my chest. "What have you done?" I demanded, my voice breaking with emotion as I stood before the fallen oak. Carol stood on the other side of the tree stump, clipboard in hand, as if it were just another task to check off her list. She glanced at me dismissively. "Hazardous vegetation removal authorized by the board last Tuesday. You would have known had you attended the meeting," she said, tossing another violation notice at me. Her next words were a blow to my gut. "This also serves as notification that your continued non-compliance has triggered Bylaw 14.2, Property Rehabilitation Intervention. The HOA now has the right to enter and modify non-compliant properties. Contractors will begin removing your barn next week." She gestured to a group of surveyors who were already marking what had always been my land with bright yellow stakes, 20 feet beyond where my property line had always been. They had adjusted my property boundary arbitrarily, as if my family's entire history meant nothing. I snapped pictures of the markers, the fallen tree, and Carol's smug expression, my hands shaking with rage. That night I couldn't sleep. The image of the oak tree, the last piece of my grandfather's memory, haunted me. My entire life was unraveling, and it felt like I was powerless to stop it. But then, as I sat on my porch in the darkness, Martha rolled up on her motorized scooter, as she often did when things got tough. "You're really going to let them take it all, aren't you?" she asked with that knowing look. "The land, the farm, all of it." I didn't answer. What could I say? It felt like the walls were closing in. Martha was silent for a long moment before she spoke again. "You can't just let them do this to you, James. Harold always said, sometimes you need to fight fire with fire." Harold, her late husband, had been an electrical engineer. He'd worked for the power company for over 40 years, and I'd always respected the way he could fix just about anything with his hands. I had a feeling Martha wasn't just talking about fighting fire with fire in a metaphorical sense. She reached into her bag and handed me a small, weathered leather-bound book. "This," she said, "is Harold's project notebook." He wrote it all down. The circuits, the plans. Some of them might be just what you need. I flipped through the pages of Harold's notebook, the diagrams and notes on perimeter security systems catching my eye. One design in particular stood out to me. A non-lethal electrical deterrent system originally intended to protect livestock from predators. The diagram showed a circuit that would deliver a mild shock to anyone who touched a specific object, but it wouldn't cause any harm. It would only activate when someone tried to tamper with it. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I drove to Mitchell's Hardware and found Ed, the owner. Ed's family had lost their own property to the Meadowrest HOA a year ago, and I knew he would understand. I showed him Harold's notebook and explained what I needed. "Something to protect my property, something to stop them from taking my land, Ed," I said, voice low but determined. Ed's eyes lit up when he understood. "You want to zap them, huh? Like a cattle fence but focused on the sign?" "Exactly," I replied. He disappeared into the back room of the shop and returned a few minutes later with a 12-volt battery, specialized wiring, and a pulse generator. "On the house," he said with a grin. "You know I've had enough of Carol and her people too." I spent the rest of the day in my barn, tinkering with the parts. By sunset, I had created a simple but effective system. I built a new sign, larger, with a metal plate and a wooden frame designed to look old-fashioned and handcrafted. The metal would conduct the electricity, while the wood would remain safe to touch. Inside the post, I concealed the battery, wiring, and a small pulse generator. I tested it on myself first. I touched the sign normally. Nothing happened. But when I tugged at it, pretending to remove it, a mild shock made me jump back. It wasn't dangerous, but it was certainly memorable, exactly what I needed. By the time night fell, I had installed the sign at the property line, making sure everything looked completely normal. I repositioned the birdhouse camera to get a clear view of the new marker, ensuring I could capture anything that happened. As I stood in the quiet night, my hand resting gently on the new sign, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm. This wasn't just about a boundary marker anymore. This was about standing my ground, protecting my heritage, and sending a message to anyone who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. Tomorrow I would finally stand up to Carol Henderson and the HOA. They had pushed me too far, and I was done running. It was time to draw the line. Monday morning arrived with the brightness of a new day, but I couldn't shake the nervous excitement that buzzed through me. I went through my usual routine, but my mind was focused on the plan I had set in motion. The new sign stood proudly at my property line, hidden in plain sight with its electrical deterrent system ready to deliver a lesson to anyone daring enough to remove it. I had set up cameras, one hidden in the birdhouse and another discreetly in a nearby tree hollow. I knew Carol would try again to take the sign down. She had to. It was the next step in her obsessive need to control every inch of this community. And I was ready. I left for the grocery store at my usual time, 10 a.m., and parked just down the road out of sight, but close enough to keep an eye on things. My phone buzzed with live alerts from the cameras. By 10:34 a.m., I saw the familiar white Meadow Rest Estates SUV pull up beside my property. My heart raced as I watched Carol emerge from the SUV, her business attire as pristine as ever, her white blouse and navy blazer catching the sunlight. She wasn't alone. Two landscapers in Meadow Rest uniforms reluctantly followed her, carrying tools. Carol's voice was loud enough for me to hear through the camera feed. "This area needs to be cleared immediately," she instructed, clipboard in hand, pointing toward my property. "The community garden groundbreaking is scheduled for Saturday, and that hideous sign needs to go first. The photographer from Luxury Living magazine will be here on Thursday. We can't have it looking like this." One of the landscapers approached the sign cautiously, his face unsure as he inspected the metal marker. "Ma'am, this is pretty serious. It says, 'Private property, no trespassing. Violators will be processed.'" Carol waved a dismissive hand. "This is HOA land now," she snapped, consulting her clipboard. "We have a new survey right here. This is officially Meadow Rest Estates common area." The second worker, squinting at the sign, added, "Wasn't this the property where we removed 6 other signs already? Maybe we should double-check." "Are you questioning my authority?" Carol's voice dropped dangerously, and she turned on the young worker. "Your company's contract with Meadow Rest is up for renewal next month. I'd hate to recommend termination over such a simple task." The men exchanged uncomfortable glances. The older worker spoke first. "With all due respect, ma'am, we don't feel comfortable removing this. It's clearly marked private property, and the owner seems pretty serious about it." Carol's face flushed crimson with rage. She grabbed the clipboard and thrust it toward the younger worker. "Hold this. I'll show you how it's done." My heart thudded harder as I watched her march toward my sign, her heels digging into the soft earth. Her expression was one of sheer determination, but I could see the irritation in her eyes. She had been thwarted so many times before, and this time she was determined to finish the job herself. Carol reached the sign and ran her fingers across the surface, clearly unimpressed with what she deemed amateur craftsmanship. She grabbed the edge of the metal, bracing herself against the wooden post, preparing to yank it free, and then it happened. When her fingers tightened around the metal and she began pulling, the electrical circuit was completed. The shock surged through the sign, and I could see it in the camera feed. Carol's body jerked backward as the current flowed through her, her eyes widening in shock. She gasped in disbelief, her mouth forming a perfect O. The clipboard flew from her hand as she stumbled back, her legs shaking from the unexpected jolt. Her voice rang out, high-pitched with a mix of shock and anger. "It's electrified! The sign is electrified!" she shouted, her tone becoming more frantic with each word. The landscapers jumped back, one of them breaking into laughter, which he quickly masked as a cough. The other 2 workers stood frozen, staring in disbelief at Carol and the sign. The older worker was the first to speak. "Ma'am, we're just landscapers. We're not electricians," he said with a nervous chuckle. "And frankly, we don't get paid enough to deal with booby-trapped property lines." Carol's face turned an angry shade of red as she pointed at them. "Cowards! You're all fired. I'll handle this myself." She reached for her phone with trembling fingers, clearly still feeling the effects of the shock. I could see her trying to maintain some semblance of control, but it was slipping away. She was furious now, and I knew this was just the beginning of the storm that was about to hit. "You'll regret this, Mitchell," she yelled as she stormed back toward her SUV. "This means war." But before she could leave, I noticed something strange. A woman across the street had been walking her dog and had been filming the entire incident on her phone. A man from 2 houses down, who had been tending to his garden, had also paused and was recording Carol's electrifying moment. Carol hadn't noticed, but the neighbors had. When she drove off in a huff, I waited for a few moments before heading back to my property, a sense of satisfaction building inside me. The sign stood proudly in its place, looking completely innocent in the afternoon sun. But now it had a story, and that story was spreading fast. I checked the footage again, confirming that everything had been perfectly documented: trespassing, attempted removal of my property marker, and the consequences that followed. The evidence was irrefutable. Little did I know, Carol's shocking experience was about to become the spark that ignited a firestorm in the community. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about something much bigger. The community was watching, and people were starting to take sides. My phone started ringing, and the text messages poured in. By mid-afternoon, the footage of Carol's encounter with my electrified sign was already all over the MetaRest community page. The comments flooded in, 78 of them within the first few hours, filled with laughing emojis and statements like, "Finally, someone stood up to her," and "Best thing I've seen in 3 years living here." I smiled to myself. Carol had no idea what was coming. That evening, a knock at the door broke my quiet reflection. I opened it to find Ian Winters, the neighbor across the street. He looked a little out of breath, and there was an excitement in his eyes. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, "I just wanted you to know that video of Carol getting shocked by your sign? It's all over the community page. There are 78 comments already. It's spreading like wildfire." "Video?" I asked, genuinely surprised. Diane, another neighbor, had shown him her phone, and sure enough, the video was everywhere. The entire neighborhood had seen it, and judging by the comments, the tide was turning. Ian leaned in closer, his voice lowering. "You should know Carol's been terrorizing all of us. My husband got fined $500 for planting tomato plants in the backyard. The Johnsons nearly lost their house because she slapped a lien on it for having a basketball hoop visible from the street. Nobody talks about it because she's so vindictive. But now, now people are starting to speak up." I was speechless. I had no idea the extent of Carol's control over the neighborhood, but after today, things were changing. It wasn't just about my land anymore. It was about everyone who had suffered under her rule. "You're not alone anymore," Ian said with a knowing smile. "This is just the beginning, Mr. Mitchell." And as the sun set that night, I realized he was right. Carol had underestimated me, and now the whole community was watching. The morning after Carol's electrifying encounter with my sign, the community was buzzing with energy. My phone rang constantly, with messages and calls from neighbors who had either seen the video or had heard about it from someone who had. Word was spreading like wildfire, and there was no stopping it now. By 7:30 a.m., Sheriff Davis's cruiser was parked in my driveway, a familiar sight. But this time, I wasn't worried. I invited him in for coffee, offering him a seat at the kitchen table, where the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the room. Tom, Sheriff Davis, had been one of my students in high school. We hadn't been close, but I had always respected him. His face was a little drawn, and he seemed uncomfortable as he sat down. "James," he began, his voice hesitant, "I need to talk to you about what happened yesterday." "I know," I said calmly, pouring him a cup of coffee. "Carol's probably crying assault and battery or something, but I'm pretty sure she's the one who trespassed, and I was protecting my property." Sheriff Davis nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair. "It's true. Technically, she was trespassing and attempting to remove your property, but she's also pressing charges for assault with a dangerous device. I raised an eyebrow. Assault? With a sign? He sighed, running a hand over his face. She's demanding an arrest. The thing is, James, the law doesn't always look at things the way we do. She's claiming that you intentionally harmed her with the electrical shock. She's made it clear that she's going to fight this. I wasn't surprised. Carol wasn't the type to back down easily. But what did surprise me was Sheriff Davis's next words. You've got a lot of support, though, from the neighborhood. I've heard a few rumors. People are starting to rally around you. Rally around me, I repeated, confused. Yeah, he said with a small smile. They're talking about you, Mitchell. You've become a bit of a hero for standing up to Carol. Some people are saying you're the first person in years to have the guts to challenge her authority. That was when it hit me. This wasn't just about my sign or my property. The shock had triggered something much larger in the community. It wasn't just me standing up for my rights anymore. It was everyone who had suffered under Carol's tyrannical rule. The sheriff continued, I'm going to have to explain the situation to Carol. She's going to be upset, but I'll do my best to handle it. If I'm being honest, though, I think she's going to have a hard time pressing charges with all the evidence against her. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a sense of relief. This wasn't going to turn into a legal nightmare for me, not if the sheriff was on my side. Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it, I said, offering him a firm handshake. Let me know if you need anything else from me. Sheriff Davis stood, gave me a nod, and walked out the door. As he left, I noticed a man standing at the edge of my property. He was holding a clipboard, and as he saw me, he smiled and waved. It was Richard Cooper, the retired judge who had recently moved into the neighborhood. I'd never spoken to him much before, but something about the way he carried himself told me he wasn't the type to stand by and watch injustice happen. Mr. Mitchell, Richard called as he approached, I wanted to come over and thank you. I saw that video of Carol. It was about time someone stood up to her. Glad you liked the show, I said, a wry smile tugging at my lips. I wasn't exactly planning for it to go down like that, but here we are. Richard chuckled, his voice low. You've done something more than protect your land, James. You've sparked a movement. People are talking, and for the first time in years, they're saying they've had enough of Carol. You're not alone anymore. His words sank in, and I realized he was right. It wasn't just about my fight anymore. It was about all of us who had been silently suffering under Carol's tyrannical HOA rule. I heard people have started talking about getting rid of her, I said cautiously. Is that true? Richard's smile grew wider. It is. There's already a petition going around, and I'm helping lead the charge. We're calling for an emergency vote to remove her as president. It's time she stepped down. We've had enough of her overreach. I felt a spark of hope flicker in my chest. This was it, the beginning of something much bigger than a boundary dispute. This was a chance to take back control of our neighborhood, to reclaim the peace and freedom we all deserved. Richard lowered his voice, his tone serious. I'd like you to be at the meeting, James. It's going to be held Friday night at the Meadowrest Clubhouse. I know you're not a member, but you've earned the right to be there. Your presence would mean a lot to the community. I hesitated for a moment, unsure. But then I realized that if this was going to work, I had to stand with the people who had my back. I nodded. I'll be there. Good, Richard said, his eyes gleaming with determination. We'll have the votes we need. It's time Carol learned that you can't just bully your way into people's lives without consequences. The conversation ended, and Richard left to continue his campaign to remove Carol. As I watched him walk away, a sense of empowerment washed over me. This fight wasn't just mine. It belonged to everyone who had been trampled under Carol's authority, and we were finally going to take a stand. Later that afternoon, my doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Diane, the neighbor who had shown Ian the video, standing on my porch with a thick stack of papers in her hands. I think you might want to see this, Diane said, handing me the papers. It's the petition to remove Carol. I flipped through the papers and my heart skipped a beat. There were over 100 signatures, each one from a neighbor who was tired of living under Carol's thumb. We're doing this, James, Diane said, her voice full of conviction. This is bigger than you and me. It's about standing up to bullies. I felt my chest swell with pride. This was it. Carol's reign of terror was coming to an end. As the day drew to a close, I couldn't help but feel a sense of change in the air. The neighborhood was uniting. People were finding their voices, and Carol's grip on the HOA was slipping. There was a lot more to come, but the first steps had been taken, and the road ahead looked brighter than it had in a long time. The final showdown was coming, and this time, I wasn't going to back down. The days leading up to Friday night were a blur. The community seemed to pulse with energy as people rallied around the petition to remove Carol. Conversations that had once been hushed, whispers behind closed doors, now echoed in every corner of Meadowrest. It wasn't just about the fines or the property disputes anymore. It was about standing up to a bully who had used her position for far too long. By Friday afternoon, the mood in the neighborhood was electric. The petitions had gathered over 140 signatures. Word was spreading fast, and the countdown to the meeting was on. As I made my way to the Meadowrest clubhouse that evening, I could feel the weight of what was happening. This was the moment. This wasn't just a vote to remove Carol from her position. It was a stand against the unchecked power of HOAs, a stand for the people who had been too afraid to speak up. I had never been to the clubhouse before. I was always excluded, a non-member in a community that was slowly becoming unrecognizable. As I stepped into the building, the murmur of voices faded. All eyes turned toward me. A few people nodded or offered quiet smiles. I had become something of a local hero, or at least an emblem of resistance. But that didn't make the room any less intimidating. Richard Cooper, the retired judge who had spearheaded the petition, caught my eye and waved me over. "Glad you could make it," he said with a grin as I approached him. "This is going to be an interesting night." "I think it's going to be a defining one," I said, trying to mask the nerves in my voice. The room was packed. Over 200 people were seated at long tables, all of them awaiting the vote. At the front of the room, Carol sat at the head of a table, flanked by two uncomfortable-looking board members. Her posture was rigid, her face tight with anger, but there was something else too. Fear. She knew what was coming. "Mr. Mitchell," Richard whispered, "when the vote happens, you just need to stay quiet. Let the people speak. The board members are already feeling the pressure. It's going to be close, but we've got the numbers." I nodded, my heart racing as the meeting started. The board called the session to order, and the first few minutes were typical of any HOA meeting. Dull discussions about the community garden, landscaping, and trivial matters. But it was all leading up to the vote. When the time finally came, Richard stood, taking the microphone with quiet authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we're here tonight to address a matter that has divided our community for far too long. Our current HOA president, Mrs. Carol Henderson, has wielded her power with a heavy hand, imposing fines and regulations that many of us feel are unjust. This meeting is about more than bylaws. It's about fairness, transparency, and the respect we owe each other as neighbors." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd. I could see heads nodding in support. Richard continued, "For those of you who don't know, we've gathered over 140 signatures in support of removing Carol from her position. This is not a decision we take lightly, but the truth is we've reached a tipping point. We cannot continue to live in fear of arbitrary fines and restrictions that threaten the homes and livelihoods of good people." He turned toward Carol, who was sitting stiffly, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. "Carol," Richard said evenly, "we're asking you to step down as president. It's time for new leadership. It's time for a change." Carol stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and faced the room. Her voice was tight, almost shaking. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "I've worked tirelessly for this community. You all have no idea the amount of effort it takes to manage a development like Meadowrest, and now you're going to throw it all away because of some petty, childish stunt?" She pointed toward me, her eyes blazing with fury. "This man," she spat the words, "has no right to be here. He's been nothing but trouble since day one." The room fell into tense silence as Carol's words hung in the air. She was unraveling before our eyes, the mask of control slipping. Her voice rose again. "I will not allow this. I will not be bullied by the likes of him, or any of you." But the crowd was no longer afraid of her. There was a shift, a collective feeling that had grown over the past few days. People were standing up for themselves. Carol was no longer the unchallenged queen of Meadowrest. "I think it's time to vote," Richard said, cutting her off before she could say anything more. The voting process was quick and efficient. Everyone had received a ballot, and the count was already underway when Carol's voice rose again, pleading for attention. "You can't do this," she cried, her face turning an unhealthy shade of red. "I'll have the county on your backs. I'll have—" Richard raised his hand, silencing her. "Carol, we've made our decision." The results were announced shortly after. By a vote of 198 to 2, the board member said, Carol Henderson has been removed as the president of the Meadowrest Estates HOA. The room erupted into applause. People were on their feet, clapping, cheering, some even whistling. For the first time in years, it felt like the community had regained its voice. The air was thick with relief and triumph. I glanced at Carol. She stood frozen, her mouth hanging open in shock. She looked like she'd been hit by a freight train, her composure shattered. "This isn't over," she shouted, her voice cracking. "You haven't seen the last of me. You'll regret this, all of you." But the crowd had already begun to disperse, the energy of the room no longer on her side. As I walked out of the clubhouse with Richard, I could hear snippets of conversation all around me. Neighbors were congratulating me, patting me on the back, and expressing their gratitude for finally standing up to Carol. "We did it," Richard said with a satisfied smile. "This is just the beginning. We've taken the first step toward reclaiming our community." Later that night, as I sat on my porch, the evening quiet settling over the farm, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. My grandfather's legacy had survived the encroaching tide of suburban development, and now so had I. The fight wasn't over yet. The HOA was still out there, and there would be more challenges ahead. But tonight, I felt a small victory in my bones. It was a victory for every homeowner who had been bullied, for every person who had been afraid to speak up, and for the future of Meadowrest. Tomorrow, the work would begin. But for tonight, I could rest easy knowing that we had reclaimed our home, and that sometime standing your ground can change everything. The days following the vote were nothing short of transformative. Meadowrest Estates was no longer the place it had been under Carol's reign. With her removal as president, a new sense of possibility settled over the community. People were talking to each other, sharing stories, and working together in ways they hadn't before. The oppressive silence that had hung in the air was replaced with conversations of hope, unity, and, most importantly, action. Richard Cooper, now serving as interim president, wasted no time in making changes. The first step was to revoke the fines that had been unfairly levied on so many residents. He initiated a new set of bylaws that required a supermajority vote before any action could be taken against non-member properties. The new rules were transparent, fair, and built on mutual respect for everyone's rights. As for Carol, she packed her things and left the neighborhood shortly after the vote. No one saw her again. The once powerful HOA president disappeared, leaving behind the mess she'd created. Her house sold quickly, and a for sale sign stood in front of her property within days. It was a quiet end to her story, one that felt more fitting than any grandiose farewell could have been. For me, the fight had been exhausting, but it had been worth every moment. What I had started with a simple act of defiance, an electrified sign, had sparked a community-wide awakening. People had begun to realize the power of standing up for what was right, no matter how intimidating the opposition. It wasn't about the land or the property anymore. It was about asserting the basic rights that we all share as individuals. It was about standing up to an unjust system and saying, enough is enough. In the weeks that followed, the changes in Meadowrest were palpable. Neighbors who had once only exchanged pleasantries now spent time together, helping each other with projects or organizing community events. The focus shifted from division to cooperation. I often found myself surrounded by families, children learning how to plant seeds, collect eggs, and care for animals in the way my grandfather had taught me. It was as if the land had become a bridge, connecting everyone in a shared experience of growth and discovery. I often thought about my grandfather during those days. I could hear his voice again, guiding me, reminding me that a man's right to his land was sacred in America. He'd never have imagined that this small piece of farmland, his legacy, would become a symbol of resistance, a beacon for everyone who felt they had no voice. But in the end, I had learned the lesson he had always taught me, that land, history, and heritage are not just things to be preserved, they are things to be fought for, cherished, and defended. As for the electric sign, it was no longer necessary. The community had come together to create something more lasting, a historical marker for Mitchell Farm, commemorating its significance to Oak County. It was a tribute to my family's hard work and dedication, a recognition of the history that had shaped the land we stood on. The sign that had once sparked a revolution was now a piece of history, displayed proudly in the community center, a reminder of what happens when one person, standing their ground, is willing to make a difference. And when I look out at the land today, at the fields my family has worked for generations, I see not only the past but the future, a future where the community is united, where people are no longer afraid to speak up for what they believe is right, and where the rights of individuals are respected, no matter how small or large their fight might seem. Lesson from the story. The core lesson from this journey is simple yet profound. Sometimes standing your ground is the only way to protect what's yours and to ensure that your voice is heard. It's easy to be intimidated by those in positions of power, whether it's a single person like Carol or an entire institution like an HOA. But when you're pushed to the brink and when you know that what you're fighting for is just and right, you have to find the courage to resist. It's also a reminder that community is powerful. What began as a solitary battle to protect my property grew into a movement that united a whole neighborhood. In standing up for myself, I unknowingly inspired others to find their voices. Together, we were stronger than any one individual or rule. Finally, the story serves as a lesson about the importance of heritage and the preservation of what matters most. My grandfather's teachings were more than just words. They were a foundation on which I built my defense. Whether it's land, history, or personal values, we all have things worth protecting, and it's worth fighting for them, not just for ourselves, but for the generations that will come after us. Sometimes the battle is bigger than we realize, but in the end, when we stand together, we can turn the tide.